After a very long delay, I wanted to follow up with Thinking Like an Engineer episode 2. And the reason why this took so long was a large part due to life changes, having a kid, moving. But that also was what made this particular app so interesting and unique in my experience coding. And my cat just wanted to join. So that's a nice little surprise. But what made this so interesting to me wasn't necessarily anything about the app, but more about how it took on a life of its own after the initial setup. Because if you go back to watch those videos, I had a lot of prep for possible ideas and things that I talked about. And it's been, I think, over a year now. So I don't even remember all the things I talked about. But the things in my head I know included doing Slack updates for status, which was about the most interesting and interactive thing I thought of at the time, or using this as an opportunity to learn things like AWS Lambda or some other serverless function, just to get a little bit more experience with that. And what ended up happening was that this turned out to be a much bigger deal practically in the life of me and my family. And it just didn't make sense to go forward with that. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about why this was such a good example of kind of the emergent behavior of apps, and a big reason why a lot of startups and businesses have moved to more agile development methodologies, both with development specifically, but also, business model, like the whole, like the lean startup, I think is a great example of that as well. A really popular one, if nothing else. But yeah, to talk a little bit more about this in particular. So whenever I built this, I wanted to get some additional notifications that the Dexcom app didn't really fill. And you can find the basics of that in this whole should send message function, which was Dexcom was limited to sending messages at a low range of 80 for a blood glucose level. And I could get high alerts much more easily. Like you can set that to, I think, probably 150 or above. You've got a lot better range. But there are also things that Dexcom wouldn't let you configure, like getting a broader notification of alerts if the blood sugar is, let's say, falling rapidly. And so those were things that added a lot of benefit to our lives, because I could get a notification that if my wife took some extra insulin and her blood sugar was falling very, very quickly, before it got to the point where we're talking about a low blood sugar hypoglycemic event, which is always scarier and harder to treat because you're dealing with the effects of low blood sugar. You're more tired. You can be more confused or nauseous, things like that. So being able to treat that better was a big win. And at the time, my wife was pregnant. So low blood sugars were more frequent and scarier and more intense even when they weren't as emotionally scary. So there was a lot of benefit there. The other thing that really helped was I could get those notifications in a different form. So a common example at the time was if I walked the dog in our neighborhood and there wasn't great internet reception there. There wasn't very much Wi-Fi that I could connect to aside from, a few dozen feet away from the local coffee shop. So sometimes those notifications would come through for higher low blood sugar, but they wouldn't go through over the wireless internet network. But I could get these text messages delivered via SMS, and that was a huge win a couple times, because then I could get an SMS and then I could call just a regular voice over IP call, and we could handle things, and it was much better that way, especially if I was, a mile or two away with a dog. So that was a huge benefit that I don't think I don't remember thinking about as clearly as, some of the other possibilities. But where it really paid off was a few months after development of this. My wife she had to be hospitalized for about 6 weeks with preeclampsia before my son was born. And during that time, she was, in the hospital and I was at home, and the, high and low blood sugar alarms are really easy to hear when you're right next to someone, but they are very difficult to hear if you are, let's say a few yards or meters away. So in a hospital setting where, you're a patient in a room and the door's shut and nurses are running about, it's very difficult for someone to hear that. And that meant that I would get these notifications sometimes in the middle of the night, and I was able to then, call my wife and have her treat the blood sugar a few times. But what also happened were times where my wife was asleep, and I had to call the nurse hotline in order to get someone to wake her up and treat her low blood sugar. And there were a few times in that where, medications and things made blood sugars wonkier. It was a great relief, to put it lightly, for her and I. And later nurses said that, they wouldn't have been able to, check for, they wouldn't have been able to check on my wife for another hour or two. And by that point, who knows what could have happened. So it was, literally a lifesaver, or at least potentially was. You never know exactly how that works out. But we're very thankful we didn't have to find out. And it made it. I tried to record a video talking about this months ago, and I was too emotional about that to, really even explain that. But that was the kind of behavior that, this app could support that I didn't expect whenever I was coding it up. And, it's a big reason why startups especially, you have an idea of what customers think you have an idea of what you think the customer is willing to use and to pay for. And then you get more and more feedback and find out here's what they actually say they want. But then you also get the difference between what their stated preference is of, oh yeah, I'd be willing to pay, X dollars per month to, have this. And then you get to build something and find out that they actually won't pay for that. They don't want to. Their revealed preference is different than their stated preference. And it means that often you're better off starting with simpler, more flexible solutions to start, things that you can deploy and iterate on more quickly, because life is often lived in the fog of war, to use a video game analogy, where you don't necessarily know what's going to happen and what the reality is versus what you think it is. Sometimes your cat jumps up and starts talking and wants to snuggle whenever you're recording a video, and then her revealed preference is that she doesn't, and she knocks over your microphone anyway. So a great example, Flora. I appreciate the visual aid. And now she's sitting on the keyboard, so even better. Let's snuggle later then. Okay. So back to the point I was making. It's better to iterate because, you just don't know exactly what's going to happen. And the behavior or the functionality that you think is secondary or tertiary is actually the thing that people care about. And if you read, any book about startups, or you listen to founders tell their stories, you figure out why. And really, it's no different for larger businesses, except they have usually a few more entrenched things that they have found the market appreciates. They've got product market fit already, but it's easy to forget about how you got there in the first place when you've already had a few successes. But fortunately, I think that is changing quite a bit compared to 10, 20 years ago. Still not there, obviously. You still have the HIPPO product decisions of the highest paid person in the organization or in the room. And, you just get their opinion and move forward. And that's happening less and less, fortunately, or at least I'm hearing less and less about it. So if it is, maybe it's just quieter. But I digress there. The point is, like, as you're building things like this, having something more flexible is really helpful for iterating, because I wanted to learn a little bit more about serverless functions and I never got the time to do it, but it would have added an extra layer of complexity, because, thinking about, the serverless function, I wouldn't have had to worry about, is the server running? Are things, is everything good there? Is there an outage with my hosting provider? But I would have still had the possibility of, AWS or DigitalOcean or whoever, or Cloudflare, whoever the serverless function provider is, they still have downtime. And then you have a lot of potential power in that. But anytime you are getting a more powerful solution, there are trade-offs, and usually it's in the complexity of implementation. So it's harder to write a serverless function versus, a Python script that, you can run on the command prompt. Or you get things that are a little bit more fragile. It's usually, if you think about like a physical metaphor, the, football player who is really, 6'8" and 350 pounds, they're not going to be as agile as the wide receiver who's 5'10", 180. It just makes sense, right? You're trading off a lot of power for that agility. And you often have that with technologies as well, where you get something that's much more scalable, but if you don't implement it exactly right, there is something that goes wrong, or there's a hidden complexity that you just don't account for. And usually you only find out after a production outage, or at least that's been the story of things I've run into in my career. So it really helps to have something nice and simple. And this is a 150-line Python script. It's hard to find something more simple and easy to iterate off of. And it made it simple so that if, let's say my hosting provider account with AWS ever, shut down or got deactivated, the credit card expired and they shut down the account rather than contacting me first, it wouldn't take more than 5 or 10 minutes to deploy this to a different hosting solution. Like, I just got to spin up a server instance or some VPS and make sure Python's installed, git clone, and then set up a cron job. Like, that's something, I can do in my sleep practically now. So it makes it really simple, and it makes it a lot easier to debug. Like, I had an instance where I added some logic about certain blood sugar checks, and it just started failing. And it took me, a day or two to realize that it wasn't just a network error or that the conditions were being met, but the messages weren't being sent. And I had a really simple log file, and it made it really easy to debug. Whereas serverless, there's an extra layer of complexity where, I would have had to go into a different CloudWatch logs or something like that. It would have been doable, but every little bit of, cognitive, every layer of complexity adds some more difficulty cognitively. And if your wife is in the hospital or you have a newborn, you need to keep things as simple as possible. So having something that was really easy to, architect, there wasn't really even a lot of, architectural thought in there, but just something really easy to implement made it a lot easier. It's kind of a tautology, but you get what I'm saying. I didn't have to stretch my engineering skills to get 99% of the benefit out of this. And that made it really easy for, extending things. Because once I found out that emergent behavior of dealing with emergent situations in the hospital, I ran into an issue with not the application, but with the user of the application. So in the middle of the night, one night, I was really, really tired, and I guess the melatonin hit a little too hard, and I slept through a few of the text messages, like the warning text messages that I would have gotten. And then I woke up for the urgent blood sugar warning. And fortunately, my wife was okay, no issues. But I realized that I could still sleep through these text messages every 5 minutes. And as I did that, or as I thought about that, I realized, I don't generally sleep through phone calls. Like, at least if I get, or if I get a second phone call, I usually wake up for that. I've got an Apple Watch, so it buzzes on my wrist. And yeah, if the first one doesn't wake me up, the second one does, 4 or 5 nines of availability in my sleep. Can't think of any instances where it hasn't, a second phone call hasn't woken me up. So I was able to then add this really easy check to say, in addition to should I send a message, should I make a phone call? And so I could build, in this case, 3 nested if statements, which not the best, not the worst. I've written a lot of code I'm less proud of, but it made it really easy to say, all right, if the, if there's a, low blood sugar warning, just call every 5 minutes. So every time there's a new reading. It also, made it easy to specify, well, if it's a high blood sugar warning, just make it every 15, because odds are we're treating it and it's just a little stubborn. So things like that, it made it really easy to implement. And I guess the other thing I should add to is, as I was trying to deal with some of the timing issues, the simpler architecture made it a lot easier, where I could just write to a text file on the server and check the last reading and the last time and check every minute. And it just made it a lot simpler. Whereas if we were looking at serverless functions or something more clever, would have had to come up with, key value store, using a database. It just would have been a lot messier, and it's really easy to read and write a timestamp. So, it just made it a lot more beneficial. And it's now something where, I'm not doing a lot of the cool stuff I thought I would, but I still have this running on a server, sending messages all the time. And, 95% of the time it's a nice little backup. And then the other 5%, it's a key part of making sure, our family is staying safe, happy, and healthy. So definitely not something I expected whenever I first started on this, but you just never know. That little side project could be the thing that changes your life, either financially or with family, helps you meet somebody or make a friend or a business connection, whatever. And so, don't be surprised and don't be ashamed of, something in your portfolio looking really simple. I've also had I've had really bad PHP and MySQL that were a couple hundred lines of, code that I think that's still on GitHub, but I don't publicize it in my profile anymore. But it led to more professional connections than anything else I've ever done. So that's another story for another time. But yeah, in the meantime, I'll talk a little bit more about this kind of app because I did, for fun, look at a few iterations using ChatGPT. So maybe I'll talk about that in the next video or a future one. But in the meantime, happy coding, and see you in the next video soon.